The way we've been buying drones basically across the DoD since GWAT is you buy a certain drone for a certain mission. And so everything's been kind of over-engineered and honestly overpriced to pull that off. That's why we're building a multi-mission drone that literally is like a flying USB. We're building the software to put any type of payload you want on it, and then you can go build that anywhere you want.
Thousands of companies show up to sell their technology to the U.S. Department of Defense each year. But so few will transition from proof of concept to true production across the valley of death. The select few who do, their stories are rarely told. Until now. I'm Noah Scheinbaum, and this is Crossing the Valley.
Hey everyone, this episode of Crossing the Valley is a special one. We have two extraordinary leaders joining us. First is Ben Kohlman, a retired F-18 pilot, former consultant, founder, and today an investor at Cubit Capital. He's joined by Dan Magy, himself a repeat defense founder, and today the co-founder and CEO of Firestorm Labs. The two are working together to bring modular, attritable systems to the defense market. Let's jump in. All right, guys. Hey, welcome back, everybody. So today we are joined by two awesome gentlemen, both in the trenches in the defense tech world. Ben Kohlman, an investor at Cubit Capital, and Dan Magy, one of the co-founders of Firestorm Labs, one of the companies that I think is doing some of the most interesting and innovative stuff right at that bleeding edge of attritable mass. And so let's start there, guys. Talk to us a little bit. Folks listening to this program may have heard kind of this term being bandied about, attritable mass. We need more systems. We need cheaper systems. What are y'all seeing in the market right now? Where are we at in this transition? How are companies dealing with it? Ben, maybe we'll start with you.
This is an idea that's been around for a while, and I think only in the past couple of years, via the war in Ukraine and even the current Gaza conflict, has it become tangible for people across the globe. And this actually ties into the Firestorm story with how we got engaged with them. I ran a group called the Chief of Naval Operations Rapid Innovation Cell starting in 2012, and this was a group of junior officers that were empowered by the head guy in the Navy, the Chief of Naval Operations, to think about new concepts. And as we would sit around the bar room table after some of our events and talk, there was a lot of conversation amongst these junior officer crews about what the future of warfare would look like. And back in 2011, 2012, 2013 timeframe, we were writing public blogs and position papers on drones, mass drones in warfare, everything from undersea opportunities to what was happening above the ground. I remember one brief to the Chief of Naval Operations, who was a former submariner. One of our junior officers literally looked him in the eye. He's 24-year-old dude, said, "Sir, in the future, you will not need submarines. You will have small vehicles in Connex boxes at the bottom of the ocean. You push a button when the flag goes up, and all of a sudden you have thousands of these things coming up." And there were admirals in the room who literally started laughing at this junior officer concept. I remember writing an article in 2013 called Drones as Barrage Balloons, and a scenario in 2035 over the straits where, F-15s and F-22s were dropping small drones to go attack the massive hordes of Chinese aircraft coming across the straits. And again, people were laughing at this concept, but we see that this was the future of warfare. And throughout 2015, all the way through 2018, and then finally the conflict in Ukraine, this is what was actually happening. The on-the-ground requirements with a couple drone experiments, they found it worked, and then they just iterated and built this over and over again. They realized there were ways to take down multi-million-dollar platforms with very cheap drones. And I'll pass it over to Dan because he's done the real work of making this reality happen. But this has kind of been in the theoretical mind for a long time, and now we're finally seeing this reality come across the battlefield.
There's two parts how I'm going to answer this question. The first is we actually are redefining attritable mass to not be just about cost. We believe it's about resupply, okay? Because even if I have 10 $100 drones and I'm on an island, if I can't get those resupplied, they're not attritable. Those are now exquisite systems. And that's why we've leaned super heavily into building at the X or close to the X, because we believe it's going to be about throughput and it's going to be about multi-mission, okay? Because the way we've been buying drones basically across the DoD since GWAT is you buy a certain drone for a certain mission. And so everything's been kind of over-engineered and honestly costed, I guess, or overpriced is the right word, to pull that off. That's why we're building a multi-mission drone that literally is like a flying USB. We're building the software to put any type of payload you want on it, and then you can go build that anywhere you want. So that's kind of like how I think about Attritable. And I think the department has realized when you look at Ukraine, war is changing. This is the machine gun meets cavalry moment where we're friends with plenty of Ukrainian pilots and even some of the other folks, quote unquote, who are working over there, where they're saying like, yeah, for a couple $1 million of drones, we can blow up $1 billion of armor. Even in a contested EMI environment, like the Russians are no slouches with jamming. They're getting through and they're blowing up, now thousands and thousands, almost 10,000 legacy systems. We saw that early. In the build up to the war in Ukraine, we founded the company with the idea to democratize the air. The whole idea was to provide smaller countries with a hedge technology or a hedge solution that they could use to hopefully deter or combat and fight back a larger hegemonic neighbor, right? Thinking of that 40,000 armored vehicles that was across the northern part of Ukraine. Can you imagine, guys, if the Ukrainians had the FPVs today? The war would have been over in the first week. They would have just massacred them. So that's kind of where the genesis of the idea came from. I mean, it goes a little bit further back too, because I started a counter UAS company where we worked with the SEALs. And ISIS used DJI drones quite effectively in 2015, 2016, 2017 to fight the best trained, best equipped forces in the world to a complete standstill because they didn't own the airspace from 500 feet and below. And that's why they found our counter UAS company that we built for sports stadiums and took it to Iraq, took it to Mosul and took it to Raqqa, and we worked with them. I saw that 10 years ago. And then I saw the war in Ukraine. I was like, God, this just makes too much sense. And even if the DoD doesn't buy it, who's going to buy it? The rest of the world who wants to defend against, angry hegemonic neighbors, because we have a couple of those out there now.
Well, I think it's important to emphasize what Dad mentioned about asymmetry. And like asymmetry in warfare is not new. Our adversaries will always go to the place where we are weakest. And there's a reason why you didn't necessarily see Iran or North Korea develop kind of fifth generation platforms. Iraq 2003 happened. And while we kind of rolled over the Republican Guard and got to Baghdad very quickly, they were smart adversaries that we were facing. I remember, when IEDs came out, we put down, I think, a $1 or $2 billion program to counter them. And we had this system in place for 2 weeks that was working. And then within 2 weeks, the insurgents had figured out a $1,000 solution to circumvent that process. And it was always a cat and mouse game. And to Dan's point, we really saw this, in 2010 to 2012 before drones came. But everybody who was under-resourced realized there were ways to defeat exquisite systems. I mean, I remember flying over Afghanistan and, we basically had this Gorgon stare program where we had FLIRs looking down at everything and drones and all this stuff. We theoretically had complete understanding of what the battle space was. But what the insurgents was do was take some of those reflective camping blankets and just put them over their positions, which basically negated our entire FLIR program. So here we have a $2 million FLIR pod on our F-18, and they're being defeated by very simple gear that they're just understanding physics. And, they lost a lot of people in that process, but they were iterative and they were willing to experiment and try things that worked. And this is exactly what happened in Ukraine, is they started with off-the-shelf drones, sort of bolting off components they could get, and evolving it to meet the specific need and find weapon warfare fit in the place of combat in a way that we hadn't seen probably in decades, because we just haven't had that crucible of combat to happen. So this is the new trend that's emerging. And I'll say one last thing about the asymmetry. I was talking to an F-15 pilot yesterday, and brand new F-15EX carries 24 AMRAAMs. They're talking about shooting 15 Houthi drones down. Well, guess how much that costs? We're firing $2 to $3 million AMRAAMs against 100K drones. Very quickly, the math doesn't add up there. And we can paint them on the side of the jet and celebrate the first female Navy pilot who shoots down someone in combat, which is certainly something to celebrate. But if you look at the trade-off, we're losing in the asymmetry war there, and we have to have a solution to kind of match the resources.
You both have, I think, incredibly pertinent and arguably the most purpose-fit backgrounds for this conversation, right? Ben, former fighter pilot, did company McKinsey, entrepreneur. Dan, intelligence background, and has also started multiple companies, including exiting one to Blue Halo on the counter drone front. You guys both understand implicitly or just deeply how innovation is really only the mother of necessity. And so, Ben, you're referencing the JIATO program. When American boots are on the ground and Americans are dying every day because of cheaply cobbled together weapons that are just produced far faster than our ability to diffuse them. Well, today our allies are in those fights. Americans are watching, we're assisting, we're equipping, we're certainly spending money in those fights. But Dan, do you see, in the conversations you're having inside the building, are we adapting our understanding of, are we beginning to change concept of operations to deal with the realities that we're seeing on the ground in places like Ukraine?
I think at the top, there's an understanding that things are different. And I think at the bottom, the guys who are in the field, I think there's an understanding. I think there's still kind of a calcified middle area that it's not quite permeating through. The biggest thing we do as a company is try and bring a lot of people to the table and educate. That's a really important thing when selling to the Department of Defense, is to show them that there is an art of the possible besides just hitting the easy button to buy a prime solution. You can read between the lines. The Ukrainians don't want any of the drones we're building because none of them can be modified. These are big publicly traded companies. These are companies that we are betting those products will help keep Taiwan safe. Ukrainians are in the EMI environment. They don't want them. Okay. That says everything you need to know. One, about how we're building products, and two, about how we're procuring things. Okay. So you can look at these big age packages that are being put together, and we should have a, sorry for the potty mouth, no shit discussion about what we're sending over there and how sufficient these things will be if there is a desire to stop a conflict in Taiwan. Because what the Ukrainians are doing and what the Russians are doing, the Chinese will do, right? Because the Chinese parts are going into the drones, right? And the Russian tactics are what Iran and China will be copying. So there are pockets within DoD that really get this and who are really leaning forward. And I'll just say in the last, 7 months since the start of the year, it's a totally different conversation than it was to last year. The thing that is kind of sad and worrisome for me is that we had a really interesting opportunity here in Ukraine, but because of how USAID money is provided, a lot of the systems had to be program of record systems, which means smaller companies did not get in there to innovate alongside Ukrainians. So the companies that are doing the best work are out there on their own time, literally providing kit and learning from folks. And so it's a totally different environment because, guys, EMI and just jamming is now the table stakes. That is the ground floor of what every environment that we're going to go operate where, an Iran, a Russia, or a China is involved in is going to have. We're trying to catch up, but we could have done so much more over the last 18 to 24 months.
I want to make sure we understand this, get this point out clearly, because especially for companies that are thinking about, okay, is there an opportunity for me in a battlefield like Ukraine, or I have a technology that I think could be usable in the front lines. What you're saying is, if you're in that position, run, don't walk, and get over there, even on your own dime. So the U.S. government is not making it easy for small businesses to necessarily go deploy there to go experiment out there. What does that look like for you guys?
For us, we've built a network. We go over there often. We have a JV with the Ukrainian partner where they can buy an EAR-99 drone and modify it, right? But that's what we've had to lean on from a direct commercial sales standpoint. A lot of the companies that are really trying to get ahead of this have offices and staff and maybe some full-time folks living over in Ukraine putting their stuff on vehicles or trying new things. I talked to a couple different startups and I've helped them get in contact with folks who can go put kit on the front lines to see how it works. The Ukrainians will do that. But that is the missed opportunity. If there's anything we're going to look back on a couple years from now, it was the fact that there was literally a laboratory where we could have done learning and we could have bought down risk for every other part of the conflict that hopefully does not happen in Indo-PACOM, and we didn't do it.
Two quick anecdotes on that in particular. The first is the innovation culture of the military. My brother, he's an active duty naval officer and was stationed in the Pentagon. And he came home for Christmas back in December, and we were just talking about his experience there. And I asked him, what's the sense around the building about Anduril? And he paused and he said, is that the sword from the Lord of the Rings? And so even my brother, who had literally lived next door to me as I was building in San Diego these innovation organizations, who has been forward-leaning, and it was in policy in the Navy, did not know the probably most famous defense tech startup. And so what does that mean for the broader culture and all the other defense tech startups that are less well known? To Dan's point, the very top, the very bottom, they are forced to engage with that reality. But the middle, they have jobs to do that don't involve cutting edge technology. It's all the things that run in the department day to day. I don't blame them for not understanding because they don't need to. But this also gets to the point of how we're developing weapon systems. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of the systems that went to Ukraine weren't that effective is they were built with a hypothesis-based approach. And those hypotheses in terms of what had to be deployed were wrong. The only way to actually get correct hypotheses, just like building a startup, is going to the market, quote unquote, or going to the crucible of combat, the laboratory to rub up against reality day after day, see what's not working, and then change the reality to fit. I think this is where product market fit again gets into weapon warfare fit the need of the battlefield. And so we have self-funded companies like Firestorm and others going to the front lines to get this real-world experience, this laboratory. And I never want a war to be a place where we're learning, but that's the best place to learn. That's where we know where all the lessons learned are going to come from. If we don't absorb those things and apply them to our systems and have a process back at home to take that real-world knowledge and test it against real-world threats, we're always going to be deficient. And one of the more controversial stands that I have is I would bet 40 to 60% of the current weapon systems we have right now on day one will be irrelevant in the cross-strait scenario. Now, I don't know which 40 to 60% are going to be irrelevant because we've been building this in a hypothesis-based approach, but they are going to fail. But this also gets to why the defense innovation industrial base is so important. The things they're building right now may be useful in the combat, but what's actually going to be the most useful part of them is when we realize we're wrong about something, we then have the ability to go back to the defense innovation industrial base and say, this is our problem. You guys can iterate quickly to solve it. Come with a solution, give it to us in 2 weeks and scale it, we'll send it back overseas. So we need to fund them now for that insurance policy to have that innovation cycle because the primes aren't going to be able to cycle that fast. We need something else that can quickly transition into those things we need to use overseas.
Ben, so to follow up on this, given Dan's point around what's happening in Ukraine and who is able to actually get out there and experiment and your kind of observations around the innovation base, how are you thinking about the companies that are in the Cubit portfolio or even companies that come to you that may say, hey, we've got this great technology. We're going to go, we think we'll have an opportunity to go test in Ukraine. How do you advise a company to think about a battlefield or an active conflict as a crucible of innovation when it's you're balancing these competing imperatives of this is a life or death situation, whether they're Americans or not. And maybe it's capital intensive to go, everything's on your own dime. You're probably not going to win a contract to get out there in the near term. How should companies think about that opportunity?
Well, I'll start with the end. I'm not sure it's capital intensive from the relative standpoint. So should I invest $5 million to build a product I think is right? Or should I invest $15,000 to fly to talk to my customers and experience what's happening? To me, that's actually a really good trade-off. And I ran a startup that failed because of this. Like we talked to some early customers, went back in a hole for 18 months, burned $7 million to build a product no one wanted, emerged and dude, it didn't matter. Had we spent $100,000 traveling and sitting there and talking and building it side by side with the customer, we then could have deployed those dollars more effectively to build a product. So I think it's actually a very small cost to go and talk to your customers. I mean, this is like Startup 101. So you have to go over there to figure it out. But this is where and Dan can speak more eloquently about this because he's been in the arena here, but the Venn diagram of understanding user needs, understanding program office requirements, and then understanding congressional requirements. Like that little sweet spot in the middle is where all the magic happens. You have to understand where each part of that ecosystem plays. So the frontline user can give you great feedback, but if the program office doesn't have funding to actually do that at scale, there's a mismatch there. And then if Congress, in their way that they're building the budget, isn't aligned with the program office, or you don't have congressional support there, you're not going to win the long run. So how do you fix that real world reality with where the dollars are coming in and all the political stuff there to find that sweet spot of opportunity?
A lot to unpack right there. But honestly, the strategy that we learned kind of at Citadel by getting punched in the face every day, and it's literally the best way to explain this, right? If you don't know how to sell to the government, you have to learn by doing. First, you got to bring in people, in my opinion, who can get you into meetings. Okay. So the first year, my co-founder, Chad, he's got great bona fides, right? He was at JSOC for 18 years. He can get a meeting, right? We had 300 meetings in a year to go understand who might have money to support a new concept, even though it is a great concept of multi-mission platform, right? But in those meetings, we actually learned what the bigger opportunity was, which is the manufacturing platform, right? If we hadn't talked to customers and we hadn't looked at you got to watch the news too, and you got to pay attention, right? Industrial base is a big deal. and the primes can't deliver stuff fast enough. So when we started hearing that, we're like, well, what if we helped solve the actual manufacturing play by giving them a product that can do multiple different things so that you're not buying one product for each thing. But to pull that off, what do you need to do? You need to find someone who's willing to raise their hand to say, yes, this is something that I need, right? They have to create basically a line item or have a line item that then I can go get appropriations for to get it funded. I mean, that's really one of the things you have to do as a startup. And we invest really heavily into lobbying because we learned, in year 4 of the last company, how valuable it will be. I'll just say, like, the ROI for this year's lobbying is 40x. 40x. What does that tell you I'm going to do next year? Spend a lot more money lobbying because the opportunity is massive. And we're actually building out a full-time presence in DC because even though we're across the engineering teams in San Diego and we have BD across the East Coast, having a presence in DC, being able to have someone do the inside-outside game at the Pentagon and do Capitol Hill, and then the co-founders will still come and walk and talk and do what we need to do for the next year. It's really, really important. And that's where you're seeing defense startups that are doing well. They're spending that money. I know Ben loves El Segundo. The problem El Segundo is going to have, guys, is if you have 50 companies in one district, how do you pick who's going to be supported, right? That's why a lot of the startups I talk to, I say you can be close, but be careful of being right in there. It's going to be really tough for you. So our district, it's well positioned in San Diego. You guys can look up who the person is, but they're a big supporter of innovation because they're from a family of innovators. And, our goal here is to be the 4th horseman of the apocalypse when it comes to drones in San Diego. You have GA, Kratos, and Shield. We want Firestorm's name to be on that Mount Rushmore. And you find the right people to support you along the way. And a lot of them are going to have to come in Congress because that is how the deck is currently stacked against small companies. But if you embrace it and understand it, then you can flourish in that environment.
It's knowing the rules of the game you're playing, which I think you make a great case for it. Lobbying is a theme that we've had others on this podcast. We had Will Edwards and what he's done at Firehawk Aerospace talk about, getting dollars on basically day one. And even if you get it wrong, sometimes it's better to be lucky than to be right. And even though it took years to kind of find that money, it was big boon for them. So I think the 40x ROI is one of those eye-popping numbers that I think will resonate with folks here. The lessons are really clear. Dan, I want to put you back in that mindset, though, of day one and kind of help take the audience through the process of what it was like opening the doors to the company. When you guys had clearly a really strong hypothesis or point of view on where the defense industry, where the ecosystem needed to go. But then what I heard from you there was, and you went and did that customer discovery process and remained open-minded enough on kind of which pieces of that hypothesis were going to resonate. So take us through early days. How did you actually start the company?
For me, it's all about a team at the early stages, right? And having been through this, I know if you have a really strong team, it helps. Ian and I are the two first co-founders. Ian is additive manufacturing aerospace guy. He's at a company called Origin. When they got bought, he ran aerospace and defense for Stratasys, which is the largest 3D printing company in the world. And then I knew we needed a guy with military bona fides, 1, to get in there, and 2, to help with product, okay? Because you guys have each said this, but if you lock an engineer in a room for 18 months, they'll build something that an end user doesn't want to have. And so when I have a co-founder who's got a voice at the table, who has used legitimately every product in the JSOC portfolio, right, which is a big portfolio, they can really give you the no shit feedback. Why would you, we cannot build that. Do you know what I mean? We knew we wanted to build something, let's call it low cost and mass producible, aimed not just at the DoD market, but overseas. It's really important. You have to find that gold star customer. That's what I call it. And I knew we needed to find that gold star customer. So we had to have a lot of phone calls. We found that gold star customer in the Air Force, frankly. They realized, kind of to what Ben's point is that, 5th and 6th gen fighters are very expensive. And so if we're going to be relevant in the next fight, maybe we have to be thinking about the smaller grouped UASs. And that's where we've really kind of flourished, I'd say, over the last year or two. Part of being a founder is having the conviction that you're going in the right direction, but then also not having the hubris to course correct to build what the actual requirement is today. Because if you can do that today, you can unlock the money to then get to the end result. That's really it. And so for us, it's always like build a drone that actually meets the MOSA standard, right? And that will have interoperability and different propulsion options so that you literally could have a utility knife, right? No one's really done that, right? In our drone, you literally can click an engine on that's a jet, or you can click an engine on that's a pusher prop. Same SKU, right? And we just think that it's gonna take a while to get the government there. I mean, we could talk all day long about how Blue UAS is not built for modularity, and that is a huge problem because the Blue UAS stuff that's approved does not work in Ukraine, and that means it's not going to work in the Pacific. Okay. So there needs to be a rethinking of modularity because guess what? War changes, like Ben said, and every 2 weeks the fight changes. We see it in about a 4-week cycle in Ukraine. How are you as the DoD going to buy stuff? Like seriously, you're going to buy stuff that's just coming out of the box does not work if you don't build in modularity and solve that. So that's our North Star, right? We'll go through all the traps to get there in the short term. But I believe if you show people an 80% solution in the DoD, right? You will, and they can touch it and feel it and watch it fly. You will help shape the requirements for what the future looks like. And that's always been our North Star, which is like get people who are excited and then show them like a product that they can then use their imagination for where it goes. And I think it's really paying off. But it is a leap of faith because you need to pay the bills today and you got to build the product for where, the future is going to go.
It's an awesome laydown. Ben, to bring you in here, where was Firestorm on that journey when you first met these guys?
They had rolled out kind of their concept, the wrong term, but I think they had the first version of the box with the 3D printed capability and then some of their early versions of the modularity. But it was really the vision of what they were trying to accomplish. I had worked closely with the Navy to deploy 3D printing in that same time period. We're talking about drones. The evolution of drone warfare, the modularity, how fast things were moving, like it just instantly clicked for me that this is where warfare had to go. And you never know at the DoD, there's high risk, but like if anything was going to work, this was the team and the product that was going to provide capabilities, and that's the end of the day, capabilities that would actually help us to win wars. And I think there was a recognition among some of the leadership that I'm fortunate to know that this is where they have to go. So it was a very de-risked bet, honestly, on what we needed to see to help win these wars.
What of the process? So super strong thesis, super strong team on the road to execution. If you think about legs of the stool there of idea and team, kind of execution horsepower, where do you see, because I'm sure you see lots of cool ideas. Where are there areas that you think, over the last, since 2019, as defense tech has kind of grown in popularity in the capital markets, and there's more, just public attention on this. What are the areas that you think companies have gotten better, or where kind of startups are starting to understand what's needed? And where are the areas where there's still, it's a few and proud who really kind of are able to break through?
One of the early theses was the primes were dinosaurs and there were different approaches to winning contracts. I think what we've seen is that the best defense tech startups have actually converged on the strategies the primes have employed for decades. There's a reason the primes have evolved their strategies. Strong GR, strong ties to Congress to get the acquisitions, strong long-term relationship with the program offices, ties to the front lines. You can't just come out of nowhere and expect the DoD to like all of a sudden have this aha moment and adopt your product. It's about relationship and power in DC, and power comes from being in close contact with people. So I think the best defense tech startups have grokked and understood that. I mean, there's the apocryphal story that Trey and Palmer tell of within 1 week of starting Anduril, they were walking the halls of the Pentagon and Congress, and they spent more money on lobbyists than engineers the first couple of years. Like, that's just the brutal reality. And they were just pulling a playbook out of what the primes had done for a long time. And so the inverse of that is with this renewed attention to defense tech, and I think a strong patriotic wave of young engineers wanting to build, they don't necessarily have that background and the scar tissue of having to sell into government. So they have a great technical concept. They go heads down. They maybe have a couple early soft customers or whoever who want their thing and build an exquisite product. And by the time they're ready to unveil it, like, oh, now we got to do business development. Well, it's a 2 to 3 year process at that point. So you really need to have either parallel process or get validation before building in the government that there will be dollars at the end of this rainbow to continue to supply your product. And so to me, it's how strong is the go-to-market team? And I'll just throw another defense tech company out there. One of the reasons we were bullish on Saronic from the beginning is because they had an exceptional go-to-market team, similar to Firestorm here. Exceptional go-to-market team in government. Dan, having been a multi-time founder in DoD, took him 4 years the first time to figure out the unlocked the kingdom. He was able to do that day one on Firestorm to know that he could build in parallel. Like, that's a differentiating factor. And I want to encourage all the young engineers to go into defense tech, but be very clear about your first hire should probably be a very strong go-to-market BD guy. Like, I was advising one of the first YC defense companies, and he said, "What should I do?" I said, "If I were you, I'd probably spend the first 6 weeks like going and building out your BD engine, your BD engine. Don't even go to San Francisco and take part in YC, like walk the halls of the Pentagon." He took a different path, and I think we get there eventually, but like, that is how crucial it is.
There's a couple of, I think, big lessons there. And I, hand to the sky, Trey came in at the company I was at the time. First week I was there and said, you guys do not hire salespeople, hire lobbyists. And kind of like, that feels gross. Like, that feels slimy. We're going to do this. We're going to win on our merits. And it was like, okay, we were green and didn't know what the hell we were talking about. And guess who was right and who was wrong, right? So I think that lesson should not be lost on anybody. What is, and Dan, maybe this one for you, there are, especially in the innovation world, and Ben, you lived this world on the inside too. I mean, there are so many of these, every command, it feels like, has an innovation organization now. And the fatigue that you imagine, the men and women in uniform who have been sitting in those billets, listening to pitch after pitch after pitch and slide deck after slide deck after slide deck of like AI this and AI that, and, JAD C2 and ABM, all of these, concepts that have come and many have gone, without seeing dramatic change actually on the battlefield. I experienced this. I imagine you guys experience this. Is there is a decent amount of skepticism of a team that comes in with a slide deck or with a great idea and says, this is what we're going to build. And so even if you're building and selling in parallel, or building and doing discovery in parallel, Dan, what did it take for you guys to kind of earn the credibility that when somebody says, yeah, this is something we'd be interested in, that you knew there were going to be dollars behind it, and that it wasn't just somebody kind of giving you a north-south to feel good?
Got to have a product, man. That's what I was saying earlier. Literally, you have to be, you can be at a 60% solution or 70% solution. You have to have something they can see and touch. I still think it's easier for people to sell hardware to the government. So I tell this to startups, like, if you're building a really cool piece of software, figure out a way to put it on a piece of hardware so that they can actually procure it. That's a big part of it. We had an infuriating number of conversations where people are like, there's no way you're going to do this, right? And then we show them something and they're like, well, okay, well, can you do this? And really what the DoD innovation ecosystem needs to solve, in my opinion, sometimes you're too early on a TRL, sometimes you're too late on a TRL. That's really frustrating and hard for a small company. I know how to raise money so I can get us through this, right? But it comes back to all of the conversations we start today pay dividends in 18 months. Like, that's literally how it works. And so you do have to kind of multi-thread this and have BD out there talking to folks. You have to have engineering skating to where you think the puck is going, right? But these innovation groups, they actually don't have as much budget as we would think. They are inundated, right? And so there's a natural amount of skepticism out there. And I think that in a perfect world, you'd go to Mother SOCOM, which has big bucks, and you'd figure out how do you flow some of those dollars into theaters where you can actually test stuff. Some of the drone things we're seeing being purchased, like, they're not going to work out of the box. It's incredible. They should be, like, before you give someone, a couple $100 million, like, let's go fly it in the theater where it's going to be used, right? Or in a theater that has the same electro, the EMI environment of where they might need to go. So, I mean, it really needs to be maybe a tighter iteration cycle. For guys like Ben, if I come with $1 million from NSW or $1 million from AFSOC or something like that, it's a good first step, but you got to figure out, like, how does that transition to bigger orders and then eventually a program of record, because that's just how the machine works. Or how do you figure out how to build a product that you can sell overseas? Because that market is so massive. And if you hit product market fit, like, the TAM overseas, I think I think the world will be spending, like, the US will probably spend $1 trillion and the rest of the world, like, our good guy side will spend $1 trillion. We're going to have to, because the world's getting less safe. So
yeah, on the defense innovation ecosystem front, I think, a lot of these innovation organizations will ask startups, okay, what's your product pathway? How do you get to where we need to go? But I think startup founders should do themselves a favor and change the question on the innovation organization is what's your success rate in taking a concept and pushing it through program of record? And I think they will be shocked at how low the transition rate is. And they can use that as a benchmark as to which organizations are effective or not. And I almost view the innovation ecosystem in DoD similar to the commercial startup segment is you have a lot of these entities that are trying to win. It's a very narrow funnel. The problem is in government and bureaucracy, we all know that programs never die. And so you actually have a lot of these zombie organizations that there's no incentive to kill them because they actually don't cost that much. And it's kind of a nice fit rep bullet for people to come in at a cruise status and whatever to say I'm part of this innovation organization. But they don't do much. Eventually they die out because they're not actually adding value. The ones that are effective, and I actually give DIU credit here, they started in 2015 and they started with, we're just going to have a presence in the Valley and they're going to fumble their way around. They had some missteps. There was the whole bring the generals out and talk to Facebook, and Facebook asked them, what can we do for you? And they're like, I don't know, we're just here to visit. But like the leadership progressively understood where the market segment was. And now that Doug Beck has taken over, they're kind of on iteration 3 or 4, I can't remember at this point, but they've like honed in on what the purpose of DIU is and what the need is. It's about scale and mass. And I think that's right. Like we're done with this experimentation, play around, fund everybody and have fun in the Valley. Like we have a real war to win. DIU has evolved to meet the specific needs of the department in an innovation sense, where a lot of these other innovation organizations haven't even gotten past step 1. So if you're a startup founder working with innovation organizations, I would interview them just as hard as they're interviewing you to realize, are they worth your time? And if they're not, quickly move on and find the person who is.
Brilliant point. It's like anything else. You wouldn't take a job without interviewing the person who's interviewing you. You should not take more meetings, especially when your time is time is valuable and scarce. 2 more things to hit, guys. First off, Dan, bring us up to speed. So where in this valley is Firestorm today? Are you all, if day 0 is find a customer and a product, and day X is, program a record, smooth sail, and just kind of sustainable growth, where are you guys at, and what are the big kind of muscle movements or the big milestones on the horizon?
We have our gold star customer. I think we've identified the path to program a record. And, I think the next year for us is going to be, let's see how some of the StratFi and AtFit stuff shakes out. We're applying for those things, and we have some very strong customer requests. And those things are built to help you transition to a program of record, right? So I would say that like in a perfect world, we get our first one in 26, 27. And then I think with what we're building, we can solve a lot of the contested logistics issues we're going to face in the Pacific. And I think some of these new commands like that are popping up on the Army side of things will be pretty interesting targets for us to go after, right? That said, like we've been hyper aggressive in our appropriations game, and I'm hopefully be able to announce a pretty good sized appropriation here when we kind of get through the cycle on the Senate side. But it's all about storytelling. And if you can tell the story to Congress and the Pentagon about how you will help them solve a big problem, like it makes the path to program a record a lot better. And we definitely have Congress very excited for buying down risk on the manufacturing and defense industrial base side of things.
What do you think are the most crucial elements of storytelling that Congress cares about?
You can actually just look at what things are talked about at think tanks, and it really helps push like where people are going. I don't know. It's hard for me to say this because I'm a voracious reader. I read 50 to 100 books a year. I think if you are paying attention to what concerns geopolitically are happening in the world, and then what some of the things that are being said at think tanks, you can really help shape a narrative to Congress that they can get behind. We've done that really, really effectively on the counter UAS side in phase 1 of counter UAS. I think we're in phase 2 now because everything's going to have to be kinetic. What we're building today, it's all about mass. It's all about closer to the edge. It's all about contested logistics. And we're telling the story that they know is a problem of being over-reliant on, the Shenzhen supply monopoly that exists today, right?
What are the best storytellers that you've seen in the space? What are the best storytellers have in common?
Dan's point about the congressional resonance is right. I think there's like public storytelling, Vice, the tactical storytelling of who your buyers are at. from a pure let's get eyeballs on something and drive enthusiasm, Jason Carmack has done a fantastic job with his S3 series, kind of highlighting hard tech companies, defense or otherwise, and really bringing you into the story of what you're building. In terms of actual congressional appropriations, I think Firestorm is front and center there. I think Saronic's done a great job of telling their story. But it's about getting people excited. It's about the hardware. It's about seeing a vision, and you can't help but want to work there. I mean, there's a reason why the average age of a SpaceX employee is like 28 and the average age of a Boeing ULA employee is like 55 or 60. It's capturing the zeitgeist of the moment. And Dan mentioned kind of the Segundo crowd later on, and we haven't made many investments in that, but I love their energy. I love their pro-America view. Their story is compelling because it's a unique part of that young generation that has a faith component. They have a politics component. They have a do hard things component. They have a run through wall component. And we need more of that in America in general. And I think when people capture that imagination and that energy, they want to be part of the story. Congress, you have Congress people flying out there to be part of that. Congress people want to be with people who are making things happen and getting on the news, because ultimately that's what they're solving for. So if you can help Congress get on the front page or get on the 5 o'clock news, you should do it. That's just politics 101.
I love it. We're going to leave the positive spin on politics. We're going to leave it right there. Ben, we have shared interests in that space, and we'll leave it there. I think one thing I absolutely agree with 100% is it is awesome and refreshing and invigorating to see a narrative among young people who are holding up flags, not just tearing them down and burning them. And I think what we see in coming out of the West Coast in the past year, and what you're seeing kind of almost a counter reaction to what the narrative's really been over the last decade, is should be inspiring to a lot of people. It is cool to build for country. It is exciting to stand for, not just against, and that's awesome. So couldn't agree more. Story is super important. Let's end with one final for both of you guys, which is that title of this podcast, Crossing the Valley. You each have had some valleys and transitions in your own career. Ben, from military to consulting to entrepreneur to now investing. Dan, from you've been in a variety of different industries and different companies. How are you guys doing in those current roles? Ben, what does investor look like for you? How does that fit? How's that glove fit versus some of the other roles that you're playing? What are the things that are exciting and new for you versus things that you've done previously?
Yeah, I think for me, I've come to realize everybody has their role to play in the ecosystem. I honestly wish I was more of a builder. My constitution is, I've discovered, maybe not aligned with that. Maybe there's a future in which I do build something. But I've really come to appreciate the alignment of heart, mind, and soul. And I think in previous jobs, I was very over-indexing on mind and brain because I've always been an analytical thinking person. But at the end of the day, my heart and soul were misaligned with that. And there were very real mental and physical consequences to that. This is a role I've found that all those three things are very well matched. And I can think big thoughts, and I can outsource the hard work to guys like Dan while still taking part in the ecosystem of defense innovation. A lot of founders who are very successful go to VC and leave within a year because they realize the 5 to 10 year cycle times and the boring nature of it actually is not aligned with what their structure is. And for me, having been an operator for a year and a half, the day-to-day grind, the uncertainty, that was less aligned with who I was internally. And so we need all of these parts of the ecosystem to work together. And sometimes you have to experiment to figure out what works and what aligns with you. It doesn't mean it closes off all future doors. And I still kind of have an entrepreneurial itch. We'll see how that manifests itself in the coming decades. Where I'm at right now, this is the perfect spot for me to contribute given my past experience. And we need founders and builders to do other things.
Yeah, taking a stab at that question, Noah, I'm actually really excited where I am right now. And it's for a couple of reasons. One is I love burning the boats and doing big things. And so running a company that is hopefully going to fundamentally change how security is provided to a lot of like-minded nations around the world. It's a mission that is so powerful and so easy to get behind that I've seen it just resonate with people, if that makes sense, right? Here, we're going to build a variety of platforms out of the same manufacturing process using a similarity of parts, and we're going to have software that ties it all together. And so we can kind of deliver a solution to somebody that they can use, hopefully, to defend themselves. It just resonates, especially with what's happening in Ukraine. So Personally, I'm very content with where I am. I'm very excited because I found an opportunity that I think is substantially bigger than counter UAS or, some of the other stuff I've done. And I think if we execute this, we can give the US and the West, I'll just say the broader West, the tools it needs to kind of defend the way of life that we love. There's been only a few times in my life where I don't consider work. This is one of them. And that means you're in the right place. You know what I mean? Fortunate enough after the last one where I don't need to be here, but I'm here to build something big and to hopefully stop a Ukraine-like invasion, right? From happening to other countries in the future. You know what I mean?
Far be it for me to speak on behalf of the country, but on behalf of the country, thank you both for what you're doing and what you've done previously and what you're doing today. It may not feel like work, Dan, but there's no doubt that it's work and it's hard work and it's thankless work. So thank you both. Ben, Dan, where can folks find you if they want to follow along, they want to learn more from you, if they maybe want to join a team? Ben, we'll start with you.
Follow me on Twitter at Ben Kohlman, BenKohlmann, or email me ben@Cubit.capital. Would love to chat.
And unlike Ben, even though Ben tells me I need to be more active on Twitter, follow me on LinkedIn, Dan Magy, not Daniel Magy. There are two of us in this country, which is crazy. Or follow us at launchfirestorm.com. Always ready to talk to young entrepreneurs. It's something that is really important to me. So if you're a young entrepreneur and you want some help in thinking about how to navigate the defense tech space, please reach out.
Gents, thanks for being here. Thanks for everything you're doing. We're rooting for you.
Thanks, Noah. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.